Greetings. I am Walt Bauer, and I'd like to welcome you to the Human Development Institute's third fall webinar. We welcome all the participants who are joining us online. Our presenter will provide an opportunity for questions today, and we welcome questions from all of our participants. Please type your questions for our speakers in the Q&A box. Please use the chat box for technical questions. You are joining the webinar on mute and without video. There is not a participant video in the webinar room. We have live captioning for this webinar today. To turn on the captioning, click the closed caption button at the bottom of your screen, and then click Show Subtitle. Please take a moment at the conclusion of the webinar to complete our brief evaluation. The evaluation will be sent to your email address after the webinar. It is really helpful as we plan for upcoming webinars. Should you have any questions about CEUs, you can contact me. My email address is walt.bauer@uky.edu. And again, my email address is walt, W-A-L-T, .BOWER@uky.edu. The title of the webinar is Blended Practices for Teaching Young Children in Inclusive Settings. It's a privilege and a pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Jennifer Grisham is a professor and program chair in the Interdisciplinary Early Childhood Education Program and faculty director of the Early Childhood Laboratory School at the University of Kentucky. I am now going to turn it over to Dr. Grisham.
Thank you, Walt. It's nice to be with everyone today. I'm growing accustomed to this format of speaking in front of groups without actually seeing folks, and I still long for the days when I'll be able to present in front of a live audience again. But it is very nice to be with you all today. I'm going to be talking about blended practices, and I think to give you just a little bit of a background about what I do and sort of how I arrived at this notion of blended practices, I'll tell you a little bit about who I am. As Walt mentioned, I am a faculty member in the College of Education in the Interdisciplinary Early Childhood Education Program. And my primary hat is that I train teachers to be early childhood teachers in bachelor's degrees. And so before I go any further, I just want to thank you all for what you do. I know many of you all are early care and education providers, and I want to thank you for what you do. I want to encourage you to reach out to me and talk to me about an education at UK. We do have bachelor's programs, we have master's programs, and we have PhD programs there. And we are in desperate need in our state for IECE certified teachers. And so please reach out to me and see if I can help you further your career. I'm also the faculty director of the Early Childhood Lab, which is an inclusive early childhood program for children that are birth to 5 years of age with and without disabilities. And my whole work has been around supporting children with and without disabilities in inclusive early childhood settings. I've done work in other parts of the world. This is a picture of me with some teachers in Zululand in Ulindi region of South Africa. I've trained teachers and providers in Spain in this picture. And the bulk of my international work has been in Guatemala, where I co-founded a children's home and a preschool for orphaned and abandoned and at-risk children. I'm also the principal investigator of the Kentucky Deafblind Project, working with children with sensory impairment and low incidence disabilities. And I'm a mom, and I'm married recently. And this is my wonderful son here, Kendall. So that's a little bit about what I do. When I became faculty director of the Early Childhood Lab, we were just in the early stages of including children with disabilities in that program. Since that time, which is about 21 years ago now, the diversity of need within our classrooms has just increased every year. And so I think that as folks that work in early care and education, our big need is to meet the diverse needs of young children. And what I mean, I'm not just talking about children with and without disabilities. I'm talking about children who have challenging behavior. I'm talking about children who are English language learners. I'm talking about children who are from different types of backgrounds than perhaps we grew up in ourselves. I'm talking about children who are very needy and are impacted by trauma. And so we have a very wide variety of children that we are trying to meet the needs of. And our question then, as people who work in early education, is how can I possibly hold 30 or 40 hands when I only have 2 or 4? Meaning that, I may have one other person that works in the classroom with me, or I may be in a classroom where it's only me. And yet I have all of these needs in one classroom. And how can I possibly address all of those needs? So I've been thinking about that for a really long time. And what I've done over the past 20 plus years is to develop a series of books and write about this notion of blended practices. And I want to define for you, first of all, what blended practices is. I'm sorry, Siri decides it wants to talk to me for some reason. And so blended practices is this idea that we are blending and combining beliefs, values, traditions, and practices, and even funds from multiple disciplines, sources, and perspectives to maximize our efforts in serving all of young children. And so instead of saying, there's a set of practices that are just for children with disabilities, or there are a set of practices that are just for English language learners, or there are a set of practices that are just for children who are typically developing. What we are trying to say with this blended practices approach is that there are practices that we need to get from all disciplines in order to support all children. And that some of the things that we do with children who are typically developing, we need to be doing with children with the disabilities. And some of the strategies that we use with children with disabilities work really well for children who are typically developing, or work really well for children who are English language learners, or work really well for children who have experienced trauma and are having difficulty with self-regulation. And that we combine together then all of those beliefs and practices into one kind of approach, if you will, in order to be able to address the needs. And so what that means as teachers is that we have to have a lot of tools in our toolbox from a lot of different disciplines in order to be able to address this very diverse need group of children that we are now working with in our early care and education setting. So let's talk very quickly about the principles of blended practices. First of all, the blended practice is to ensure that all children have the opportunities and the supports that they need in order to thrive. And so regardless if this is a child that is receiving services because they're in Head Start, because they're receiving child care assistance, because they're receiving publicly funded pre-K, because they are a typically developing child whose parents want them in a high quality early care and education setting, regardless of why they are in our program, that all of those children that are there have the needs and support, that have the supports that they need in order that their development is enhanced. That's the number one principle. The second principle of blended practice is that we acknowledge that we need a variability in our instruction, that we cannot do the same thing for all children all the time because every child is different. Even if I work in a classroom where I have children and they're all the same age and they're all, the same gender and they're all have the same background, there's still going to be diversity. And so I have to vary my instruction for those groups of children so that I can meet the developmental variability that I'm going to see in each and every child. The third principle is that we believe that authentic assessment is at the heart of designing and delivering quality early care and education. And so what do I mean when I say that? When I'm talking about authentic assessment, I'm not talking about testing young children. What I'm talking about is I'm talking about gathering information for purposes of making decisions about children. So gathering information to get to know children better, to understand their developmental level, to understand what their interests are, to understand what their needs are, so that I can make sound instructional decisions and meet the needs of each individual child. So how do I go about doing that? That's the question. How in the world can I implement blended practices? And so the way that we talk about this is through something called the curriculum framework. And the curriculum framework is a series of 4 components or 4 elements that are combined together, that are linked together, if you will, to comprise a total framework for how to support children in inclusive classrooms. The 4 elements that are part of the curriculum framework are assessment, scope and sequence, activities and instruction, and progress monitoring. What I'll be doing today is talking to you about each of those elements and then sharing with you a planning form that I think might be useful to you as you try to individualize instruction in classrooms to meet the variability in development of the children in your program. So the first element, very briefly, is assessment. And as I said, assessment is gathering that initial assessment information to learn about your children. Now, whether you're doing that through observations or whether you're doing that through talking to the child's parents, or whether you're doing that through using some kind of a curriculum-based assessment, you're still using it so that you can get a picture of what that child knows and what that child needs right now. The second element is scope and sequence. And scope and sequence is that kind of bridge, if you will, between assessment and instruction. Scope and sequence is the what we teach. What are the skills? What are the developmental needs that we're going to address for the group of children that you're working with in any given year, or for the individual child that you're working with? The third element is activities and instruction. And activities instruction are the events that occur in our classroom, but they're also the strategies that occur. So many times in early childhood, we spend a whole lot of time developing hands-on activities and developing a schedule and developing centers. And that's important. It's very important that we have developmentally appropriate materials, and that we have just the right amount of books in the classroom, and that we have a curriculum that addresses diversity in the classroom. That's all very, very important, but it's insufficient. In addition to that, we also have to know what the instructional strategies are that we're going to use to teach the children. So I'm going to talk about that a little today. And then finally, progress monitoring. And progress monitoring is what we do after we've implemented our instruction to see whether or not it's working or not. Do children still enjoy these activities? Are children advancing developmentally? Are children engaged with the materials in the classroom? That's what progress monitoring is. So we use the analogy of the umbrella for a couple of reasons. First of all, an umbrella, of course, is something that kind of keeps us dry. So in a kind of cliche kind of way, it helps us, it supports us, if you will, in implementing the programs for children in inclusive settings. Also, the umbrella is tied together by these spokes, if you will. And what we know is that if you've ever been out on a rainy day and your umbrella has messed up on you, and one of the spokes have done, then the water comes rushing down on you. And so what that means in the analogy here is that all 4 of these parts or these components are linked together. That if we don't have good information about our children through assessment, we're not going to be able to select the right developmentally appropriate goals. And if we don't have the right goals, then we're not going to be able to design instruction that's appropriate for children. And so all of those pieces have to be up, they have to be working, and they have to be in place. The other thing about an umbrella is that it's bigger at the bottom than it is in the top. And what that signifies is that the practices that we do at the bottom are foundational. They're foundational to the umbrella, but they're foundational to our practices in early care and education. So these are the practices that we do with all children all the time, every day. Things that we are really, really good at as early care and educators. That environmental piece that I talked about earlier, making sure that we have an environment that works for children. That's in Kentucky, we love our Eckers. And so that's Eckers ready, if you will. That's all part of what is important for all children. But then for many children, that's not going to be sufficient. And so as we move up the panels, our strategies become more specialized, they become more intentional, they become more individualized. So we're going to be talking today about practices that are down here, but also what happens if those practices aren't working? What if the child is still having difficulty in the class, even though I've got a score of a 6.9 on the Eckers? What do I need to do next? That's what we're going to talk about. So in the middle here, we're talking about practices that we do with some children, or what I refer to as tier 2 practices. And at the top, we're talking about practices that are for individual children who are really, really struggling, who have barriers to learning, who are missing important prerequisite skills. So what do we do for those children as well? The umbrella is held up with collaborative partnerships, which means that we can't do this by ourselves, that we have to work with our leadership in our program in order to be able to meet the needs of all children, that we have to have high quality professional development. That's not just another make it, take it. I'm sorry to say, those things are wonderful, but we have to get down and dirty and start thinking about, how do I meet the individual needs of the children? And then also learning about how to make instructional decisions based on data that we collect about children. So I'm going to begin now by talking about each element of the curriculum framework. First of all, as I mentioned, is assessment. And assessment in this case, again, is gathering information for purposes of making decisions. I am not a believer in testing children. I'm not a believer of sitting down and asking children to perform tasks upon demand. That's just not how children are. That's not how they are. They don't perform well when we ask them to do things upon demand. And so with this type of assessment, we call it authentic, because we are gathering information about children within the environments in which they spend time. So if there are any home-based providers out there, then I am gathering information in the child's home. If I'm an infant provider out there, I'm providing it perhaps in the home or perhaps in an infant toddler classroom. But wherever that child spends time, that's where I'm gathering information. And I'm gathering information about children using what we call authentic assessment practices, which are observing the child in their natural environment and talking to people who know that child well, who can give us some perspective about what that child knows and what that child needs to learn. And I'm also gathering information about functional skills that that child needs in order to be as functional and as independent in that environment as possible. So this assessment is a guide to help us learn about instruction, help us learn about the child so that we can plan instruction. It serves as a baseline to us for where we go next with the child. It's authentic, as I mentioned, and it's comprehensive. With everything that's going on right now about this notion of kindergarten readiness, it worries me. It really worries me that we focus sometimes, especially for children that are 3 and 4 years old, way too much on early academic skills, sometimes and without thinking about other areas of development that are equally important to a child's success when they enter school. And so when we talk about assessment, we're not just talking about finding out if children know their colors and their numbers and shapes and sizes and can write their name and their alphabet, but we're talking about other areas of development. Can a child, use their hands and manipulate objects? Can a child follow 2 or 3 step directions? Can a child follow a social routine? Those are all so critical. And if you look at research on, what people say is important when children enter school, it's those skills that are equally important to the other skills that we sometimes focus on as children are about to enter school. And so as a result of this assessment, we should get information about the developmental and content areas that children need practice in, what the child's interest and preferences are, and what are the family's resources, priorities, and concerns. And so some things that we think about when we're doing assessment is that this is program planning assessment, as I talked about. That, as I said, we're using authentic assessment practices, interviewing caregivers, observing children in their natural environment, and using work samples of their work. I'm also a very strong proponent of early care and education settings using a curriculum-based assessment. And the curriculum-based assessment is a tool that is linked to a curriculum. And so it's not a test, but rather it's a tool that yields information about skills that you can actually teach in the classroom. And I'm sure that there are resources out there. There is a continuous assessment guide that's been developed by the Kentucky Department of Education that's often used to help you select a curriculum-based assessment. And if you want more information on that, please ask questions about that and we'll provide that information. The second element of the curriculum framework is scope and sequence. As I mentioned, scope and sequence is that bridge between assessment that I just talked about and instruction that I'll talk about shortly. And so what I want you to see is that when we are addressing the needs of diverse groups of children, that we are simultaneously addressing three sets of outcomes. Tier one is what we call common outcomes. These are the outcomes that we are working on with all children all the time. Tier two outcomes are those that we're working on with some children, and tier three are those individual outcomes, and sometimes are considered IFSP or IEP goals for children who have disabilities. And so some of you all may be working in settings where you have children who receive early intervention services. And so those IFSP outcomes or goals would be considered tier three outcomes. So let me talk about each in a little bit more detail. So tier one are common outcomes, and it's what we would expect for a given age. And so if you're working in an early care and education setting, you are very likely very familiar with the state early learning standards, which are in the process of being revised, I understand. And those state early learning standards should be connected to our curriculum. They are not a curriculum themselves, but they're meant to be benchmarks, if you will, for what children between the ages of birth and 5 years of age should learn in the state of Kentucky before they enter kindergarten. And so early care and education providers are always encouraged to rely on the state early learning standards in developing their curriculum. If you're working in a Head Start program, you might also need to address the standards that are part of the Head Start outcomes framework, which are a set of outcomes that the Head Start Bureau have developed. If you work with children with disabilities, you may also have to address the Office of Special Education program standards. If you work in kindergarten, you're addressing Common Core. So there are lots of standards out there. Those are foundational to everything that we do. We are obligated as early care and education providers to address one or more of those sets of standards. These standards are common. It's what everybody is expected to learn. They are developmentally and culturally relevant. So there have been a lot of really smart people and a lot of people that have expertise in early care and education who have put together these standards and said these are appropriate expectations for children in Kentucky at this time. And they're also comprehensive, meaning that they cover all areas of development. Now, sometimes children, they struggle with one or more of the standards. And if that's the case, then we might have to look at what we call tier two standards. And with tier two, we have a child that maybe is having difficulty with some component of of an outcome. And so think, for example, about a child that's having difficulty writing their name, if that's something that you're working on. That's one of the early learning standards. And if a child is having difficulty with that, there could be a variety of reasons that they're having trouble with that. They could be having trouble with that because they haven't learned an earlier skill, a component of that skill that they need to be taught before they can write their name. So just the other day, I was listening to one of our teachers at our center talk to a parent about their child was, the parent really wanted the child to learn their name because they knew that the child was going to kindergarten. And our teacher was explaining that children need to learn they need to draw. They need to learn how to draw first. They need to learn how to write pseudo letters first. So there are earlier skills, components of that bigger, larger outcome that children must learn before that they can sometimes reach that outcome. And so those are the skills that we may have to teach first. Another reason why a child might not be able to write is that there's something going on with their motor ability that's preventing them from being able to do it. So perhaps the child has very low muscle tone, or they don't have very good fine motor skills. And if they don't, then then when they draw, you can barely see what they're writing on the paper. Then what I may need to work on first is working on those fine motor skills. So instead of trying to teach them to continue to draw or to continue to write, I may need to teach them to increase the force by working on fine motor skills so that they can do that better. And so these are components of the larger outcome that I'm working on with the child so that I'm supporting them to work toward those bigger outcomes. With Tier 3, we're looking at foundational skills or milestones that a child may not have attained yet. And so if I have a 4-year-old in my program and a 4-year-old, we would expect is already using sentences to express their wants and needs. They're asking questions, they're commenting on things. But if I have a child that's still using gestures and sounds to answer, then I'm going to have to work on earlier communication skills with that particular child. Those foundational skills, those milestones that perhaps that they are missing. Similarly, if a child is having difficulty with very prerequisite basic skills, if they can't follow a social routine, if they don't have joint attention, then they're going to have a lot of difficulty attending to group activities and learning important early academic skills. So I'm going to have to teach them those prerequisite skills first before I can expect them to learn more complex skills. Also, sometimes children have a barrier to learning. Children who, for example, have difficulty attending to tasks for more than 2 or 3 minutes. Children who are English language learners who are just moving into our classroom who don't know any English. That's a barrier to them being able to be successful in our program. And I'm going to have to teach that barrier. I'm going to have to help them overcome that barrier before I can expect them to learn anything else. So Tier 3 outcomes are skills that are highly individual and unique to a given child. They are critical for the child to be able to access and participate and make progress toward those larger outcomes. I'm not going to learn my shapes if I don't understand English. I'm not going to be able to sit and draw and learn early writing skills if I don't have the attention span to be able to sit and do a group activity. I'm not going to be able to learn to share and interact with my friends if I can't establish joint attention. So those very basic skills are what we call Tier 3 outcomes and what we sometimes have to focus our attention on before we can expect children to learn more complex skills. So that's scope and sequence. The third element of the curriculum framework is activities and instruction. And we talk sometimes, you'll hear the word tiered instruction. And we talk about 3 tiers of instruction in the work that I do. The first tier is universal instruction. And going with our convention that we've used before, this is instruction that we do with all children all the time. It doesn't matter if the child has autism. It doesn't matter if the child is nonverbal. It doesn't matter if the child has challenging behavior. These practices need to be in place all the time. They serve as the foundation. They are deeper, they are wider than all of the other because they are so important for early learning. The second tier is what we call focused instruction. And that's for teaching some children who are having difficulty learning a component of an outcome. And the third are systematic instruction. And those are the strategies that we use when children are learning those foundational skills that I talked about a minute ago. And I'm going to give you examples in each of these tiers. But first of all, let me talk to you about what is the same regardless of what tier of instruction that you're using. First of all, across all of those tiers, we are using prompts. And a prompt is something, think of it as some level of support that we provide a child to assist them in learning something new. So if I'm using a gesture, or I'm giving a child hints, or I'm giving them some physical support, I'm using a prompt. And that we use those across all types of learning and all types of teaching strategies. The other thing is that I use complete teaching sequences. And so a complete teaching sequence includes three components. It includes setting up a situation so that a child has an opportunity to respond. So if I'm in a large group circle activity and I'm asking a child today we're going to count our friends that are at school today. And so that is setting up the situation. And maybe I hand a pointer, with a little finger on it so that one child can go around and touch each child and count the children. I've set up the situation. Now, the child who is expected to count, that child has a couple of opportunities. They can either, use one-to-one correspondence and count each of their friends that are there today. And if they do that, then the third component of the teaching sequence is the teacher's going to say, great job, you counted all of our friends. We have 15 friends at school today. If the child doesn't do it and they say 1, 3, 4, 7, 2, and they don't count, and they don't use one reinforcement, then I've got to provide feedback for that too. And I'm going to have to use some kind of a prompt to support the child to do it correctly. And that sequence of setting the occasion, allowing the child to respond, and providing feedback, that teaching sequence is one that we use regardless of whether we're using tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3. And so that's just a really important sequence to always keep in mind. Also, we're intentional about our instruction. And the way that we are intentional is by making sure that we know what it is that we're teaching at all times. What are the skills? What is the focus of instruction? In early childhood education, we get a bad rap a lot of time because people, they think we're babysitters, or people think that, we are, we're not teachers. They think that all of our children, all they're doing is playing, that our children are not learning. And we know that that's not true. But one of the ways that we have to know and show that that's not true is being able to articulate what we are teaching in each of the activities in which we set up for children. What are the goals? What are the outcomes that we have in mind? So that intentionality is very important to what we do. And we also have to use the data. We have to gather information to see whether or not instruction's working or not. We need to gather that information and make instructional decisions based on it. As we move up the tiers, the differences are that the teacher's role changes. And so when I'm down at the bottom universal tier, the teacher is acknowledging, the teacher is using good questioning, the teacher is building concepts, the teacher is building relationships with children. And all of that's important, and none of that goes away. But as I move up to tier 2 and tier 3, the teacher inserts and becomes more, has a more intentional role, where, for example, the teacher is giving specific praise, where the teacher is giving a specific set of prompts in a certain order, where the teacher is providing other types of very specific feedback. The other thing is that we move up the tiers, we become, we start to instruct with greater precision and consistency. And so if I have a child in my classroom, think of it this way, who has challenging behavior, and we have decided that, when that child engages in challenging behavior, then we're going to do this. or when the child is not engaged in challenging behavior, let me put it that way, that's a better way of putting it, then we are going to reinforce that child for every time that they are using good hands, or every time that that child is sharing with a friend, or every time that that child is sitting and engaged appropriately with materials. So that procedure, which is called differential reinforcement, if I'm using a tier 3 procedure like that, all right, then everybody has to be consistent in doing it. Everybody has to consistently do it. So as we start to use these more intensive kinds of procedures, then what we have to do is that we have to be really consistent, and that continues, and we become more consistent as we move up the top of the pyramid. And then we have to do it with greater intensity and greater frequency. If I have a child that's nonverbal and can't speak, I need to provide that child with many, many, many opportunities throughout the day so that that child can learn to speak. I need to make sure that that child has the opportunity throughout their entire day so that they can have opportunities to request, to use the language that they have. So that becomes important too. So I think that I've talked about those things enough. Let me start talking a little bit about characteristics of universal instruction. And Walt, I don't know how this works with the questions. And so I know you said that they don't go in the chat box. And so at any point, if you want to pause me and have me answer any questions, I'm happy to do that.
I'd be happy to. We don't have any questions yet, but when they come, I will let you know.
All right, great. I'll continue then. So characteristics of tier 1 instruction. First of all, as I mentioned earlier, it's delivered to all children all the time. It addresses those universal needs. And so remember, I talked about those universal or common outcomes for children. These are the state early learning standards, or the Head Start outcomes framework. They're part of the flow of the classroom. I always say when I talk about, what is the universal curriculum? What are we teaching all the time with young children? Color, number, shape, size, alphabet, counting. Those are things I see starting at a very, very young age in early care and education programs. They are part of the flow. We're counting the number of friends that are here today. We're counting the number of steps that we walk out to go out on the playground. We're counting the number of leaves that we see. I mean, we're counting all day long. We're pointing out colors all day long. So those are things that are just constant that go on. And they're set up to support and strengthen early education, early development. And we're providing multiple and varied opportunities for children to respond when we're providing tier 1 instruction. So here are some examples of universal or tier 1 strategies. The first one is hands-on materials. And, that's at the heart of everything that we know, that children learn by doing. They learn by engaging in play activities. We also know that children learn best when they're engaged in activities that they're interested in, that are novel. We also know that children learn best when they're engaged in a high-quality learning environment. And so one of the reasons why we have so much emphasis in Kentucky on the early childhood environmental rating scale, the ECHRS, is because there's ample research to show that there is a relationship between your ECHRS score and child development and how well children and child outcomes. And so we want to build a high quality learning environment in order to promote positive outcomes for children. We also know that we need to support children's social interactions between children, that is so critical. And in fact, many years ago, I did a study where we asked kindergarten teachers the kinds of skills that were most important to them when children entered kindergarten. And it wasn't color, number, shape, size. It was that children could get along well with each other, that they could follow directions, that they could take care of themselves. So that social emotional development is equally important to academic growth when children enter kindergarten. And the basis of all of this is nurturing relationships between adults and children. And part of the way that we do that is that we provide instructional support by modeling language for children, by asking open-ended questions that allow children the opportunities to respond. Providing repetition and extending activities that children are interested in, by using self and parallel talk, and by introducing new vocabulary. So many of the children that we work with today are experiencing trauma, and that's become even worse. I think there's a new study out yet again about the drug crisis here in Kentucky, and we all are probably experiencing and working with children who are impacted by that crisis. Those children are growing up in trauma. Those children are oftentimes growing up in poverty. And we know that when children grow up in poverty, that children do not get access to the same language models that children who are from middle and high income homes get. And so when children come to our centers, when children are engaged in our program, it is so important for us to provide those language models to try to build that vocabulary for children, because that's the single best thing that we can do to support their later success in school. So a few slides just to talk about some of these. Building those supportive relationships with families is very important. And that is a challenge sometimes for us. Families have just gone through a very difficult time, as we all have. And so building those relationships is also going to help us support children. And building those positive relationships with our colleagues is also very important.